Good evening, everybody. It's 1 minute past 6, so we'll make a start. There may be a few more people still to join, but good evening, and thank you all very much for joining us for the launch of the BEARR Trust's Ukraine Community Resilience Fund, and it's good to see so many of you on the call this evening. My name's Ross Gill. I'm chairman of the BEARR Trust. There are quite a few other BEARR trustees in the audience as well this evening, so there's a fair few of us. But we're especially delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Victoria Donovan, who's going to be discussing her new book, Life in Spite of Everything, Tales from the Ukrainian East. And I'll look forward to introducing Victoria further in a few minutes' time. But an especial thanks also to those of you that are joining us this evening from Ukraine. I know there's some of our partners in Ukraine that are joining this evening, and some others that we've been in touch with as well. So thank you very much for making the effort, and really pleased to see you here. We're going to be recording this evening's talk so that it'll be available on our website in a few days' time. So if you want to share the recording with others that can't be here, then please do. Once we get into the talk, you might also have some questions that you want to ask of Victoria, and we'll make sure that we leave some time at the end of the session this evening to do that. If a question occurs to you while we're speaking, do put questions in the chat as you think of them, and then we can pick them up at the end. But we'll try and invite people who have put questions forward to ask them, so that we get a bit of dialogue as well. So before we get into it properly, I'll just say a little bit about the BEARR Trust and about our Ukraine Community Resilience Fund that we're launching today. And quite a few of you in the audience today will know about BEARR, and there's quite a lot of old friends that are here. But for those of you that don't, and maybe haven't come across us too much before, we're a small UK-based charity. We've been going since the early 1990s, working with community-based organisations that are supporting vulnerable people in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. A lot of our activity has always been in Ukraine, and we've always had a lot of partners in Ukraine. Following the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, many of you will be aware that we launched a Ukraine emergency appeal to support our partners in providing humanitarian assistance on the ground. And of course, many of those organisations, those community groups that were involved in supporting particular vulnerable groups in the community, doing things locally on the ground, were the very same people who, in a time of crisis, moved to being the last mile of emergency aid and responding very much to the needs, the very great needs that there were at the time and have been since. Since we launched our appeal, we've supported 74 community-based organisations in Ukraine and in Moldova, with grant funding that's enabled them to distribute food, medicine, hygiene products, first-line mental health support, and bring displaced people and host communities in some cases together as well. And thanks to the generosity of our donors, and I know we have a number of donors in the audience this evening, we've received and now spent 100% of about £572,000 since February 22. Today we're launching something a bit different, a new development from that, which we're calling the Ukraine Community Resilience Fund. And that's going to continue to provide small grants to community-based organisations that are helping those people that are most affected by the war. What we really want to do is to make sure that we channel our support to those local groups that, again, are the backbone of their communities, that were active before the war, that are active now, and will be there in the future. And we want to support that resilience for the future whenever the war comes to an end. And of course, that's especially needed now, especially given the environment for international aid, the withdrawal of support from USAID, and so on. Since we started our appeal for donations in the middle of April, we've raised over £50,000 in donations either in the bank or committed. And there are some people that we are especially grateful to. In particular, District 1100 of Rotary Great Britain and Ireland, who have been very generous in their support. We've also secured a 3-year grant via Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors in the United States, and there is another grant that we'll be receiving later in the year as well. And we're really grateful to all of our individual donors, so thank you very much for all your support. We'll keep you updated on the communities that will benefit from your generosity, and many of you will receive our regular newsletter. And if you don't, it would be great if you could. So we'll try and get you to sign up to that. And thank you very much. We'll keep you updated. And thank you for your generosity and solidarity. So that's a bit of an intro to our new Ukraine Resilience Fund. And thank you for all your support in getting us this far. I'm now especially pleased to introduce Victoria Donovan, who's agreed to speak to us this evening. And Victoria is the Professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies and the Director for the Centre for Global Post-Socialisms at the University of St Andrews. And her work really links, well, we'll talk about this when we get into the discussion, a whole range of different areas of study linking urban history, heritage studies, industrial history, visual anthropology, creative arts, a whole sort of range of things that come together in this amazing book, Life in Spite of Everything, which has just been published. Among her other publications, there's one that you can find for free on the internet, which is Limits of Collaboration, Art, Ethics in the Donbass, written with Daria Zimbalyuk and others. So you can download that and read that. And of course, you can buy Life in Spite of Everything in the bookshops now. Writing in The Observer last week, one of many very positive reviews for the book, Andrei Kirchhoff describes the book as a story of people and nature filled with sweet and bitter memories, empathy and hope. Victoria, welcome to the BEARR Trust, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So I'll kick off by asking about how you got here, really, because your research into the Donbass predates the full-scale Russian invasion by some time. And the core of the book, the heart of the book, really draws on your experiences and the people that you worked with and interacted with in the Donbass long before February 2022. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about where did that interest come from? What started that interest in Eastern Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Well, my work on Eastern Ukraine began really back in 2016 when I found out about an archive in my hometown of Cardiff that related to the history of labour migration from South Wales to Eastern Ukraine. And it was a history about which at the time I knew very little, actually nothing. And it came as a real surprise to me because as somebody who'd been brought up in South Wales, went to school in Cardiff, and who'd later gone on to study Russian imperial and Soviet history, it should have been something that I knew about. The fact that miners, coal miners, and mine managers from South Wales had gone to today's Donbass in the 1860s up until 1917, and they'd contributed to the development of industry there. So I found out about this archive just because I was Googling kind of links between Wales and Ukraine, because I'd always felt they were kind of similar places just because of the language, politics and industrialization and things like that. And I just happened across this archive, which was called the Hughes-Ovka Research Archive. And it's called that because the industrialist, the mine manager who led this sort of wave of labour migration from Wales to Ukraine at the end of the 19th century was called John Hughes. And he was from Merthyr Tydfil originally, and he was invited by the then Russian Tsar in the sort of late 19th century to go and to kind of try and help develop some of the mining and the metallurgy industries in that region of what was then the Russian Empire. And he took about 100 or so kind of mining engineers and chemists and and managers with him, and they took this kind of convoluted route by land and by sea, and then across the steppe to today's Donbass, which is located on the kind of Eurasian steppe belt, so this very flat landscape. And there they created this company town, which they called after John Hughes, Hughesovka. And Hughesovka that's the Russian name. The Ukrainian name was Yuzivka. And it was called that for up until the revolution, when the Bolsheviks came to power, and then they weren't very keen on these foreign capitalists. So whichever of them were remaining got chucked out. And the city was renamed firstly Stalin, and later Stalino after Joseph Stalin. And then after de-Stalinization in 1961, it was renamed again Donetsk. So that city that was founded by these Welsh industrialists is today's Donetsk, which, as we know, is the capital of the Donetsk region, which is now almost totally occupied by Russian forces. So it struck me, it was 2016, so before the full-scale invasion, but already in 2014, part of the region had been occupied when Russia began its military operation in Donbass. And so Donetsk was already occupied then. So it struck me as a very sort of a remarkable historical chapter that wasn't really known about in Wales at the time, was much better known in Ukraine, actually. There was a monument to John Hughes in Donetsk still at that point in time, with his anvil and his waistcoat on, standing in front of, I think, the city hall. And so I got really intrigued as to why this had happened. And it turned out to be part of a much larger story of foreign capital investment in lots of industrial regions of what was then the Russian Empire. But Donbass had been this particular area of interest for foreign capitalists because it contained so many valuable minerals. And, we've been hearing a lot about the minerals again now in connection with Trump's mineral deal. Back at the end of the 19th century, the minerals of strategic interest were different. It was the coals and the chalks and the gypsums and the salt that sort of Western industrialists were interested in extracting. But Donbass was still this very kind of this region that had the promise of these kind of valuable minerals that could be extracted and could make people's fortunes. So that was how I began to kind of get into the history of this region. It was, through this odd connection between my hometown of Cardiff and Eastern Ukraine.
So it's a really interesting sort of starting point. Where the starting point of interest isn't actually in Ukraine, is it? It's sort of miles away, and it's how those connections get made.
Yeah.
And I guess you could have written an academic book, and maybe that was your idea at the start, for given your role. But the book itself isn't an academic book at all. It's a very engaged book, isn't it? And what kind of changed? What moved it from being this study of the history of this industrial place and the links back to the UK into something which is very much about the people and a much more engaged and not detached book at all?
Yeah. Well, so after I started researching this history of labor migration, and I should say, because often that history gets presented in very romantic terms as like these great, intrepid British industrialists who kind of developed the economy of the Russian Empire and brought all of their expertise and all of their like superior equipment and knowledge to the East and kind of brought with it all this civilization. That's how it often gets presented. But this history is very much part of an entangled history of colonialisms that has always kind of seen this part of Europe as an extraction resource, a place where a lot of money could be made, and that's still the case now. But after I sort of started to research that, I became really interested in kind of the longer history of the region. So not just this early history of pre-Soviet industrialization, but also what had happened after the Soviet Union was established, and this region became really one of the flagship regions of Soviet industrial modernity, and was heavily marketed in Soviet propaganda as a kind of a region where these heroic laborers were overfulfilling their quotas and mining 40 times more than their allotted quotas of coal and hewing, superhuman amounts of steel. And then, how that sort of that mythologization of the region continued throughout the 20th century. And then after the end of the Soviet Union, what happened then when, the state support for industry disappeared. And so a lot of the mines and factories that had been established in this region, they were defunded. They lost their financial support from the state, and kind of predatory oligarchic elites began to circle round and buy up various parts of the industrial infrastructure, sometimes kind of selling it off for parts or closing it down. But on the whole, treating the communities who had lived and worked in the industries there very inhumanely, and being very sort of extractivist in their approach to the local economy, and how that then kind of intermingled with the post 2014 history of the region when Russia began its military operation there. So I was really interested in all of this, but I also wanted to go to the region and see it with my own eyes. So I went for the first time in 2019 with my then PhD student, Daria Cymbaluk, who you already mentioned, who we wrote a book with. And we did a summer school in Severodonetsk, which is now occupied and destroyed. And back in 2019, it was a really vibrant, very, very pretty, very homely city that was kind of founded around a nitrogen factory. So it was what might be referred to as a monotown, a monofunctional town that had one industry in it, and most people who worked in the city worked in some way, either in the industry or in some kind of branch of the industry that was kind of funded by it. And so I went, and I was really kind of sort of enchanted with this super interesting place with these layers of history, and this remarkable sort of presence of industry that was, on the one hand, quite difficult and sort of had this toxic influence on local life, but also was community forming and value forming. So it was this very sort of complex history and heritage that people were living with. And so I wanted to write a book about that history, and about the kind of the sort of contemporary culture, and also the vibrant kind of activist culture which I encountered in the region, because after 2014, government-controlled Donbass became this sort of center of cultural activism. So even though it had been kind of heavily stigmatized and thought of as a place that was just characterized by heavy industry and war, it was actually sort of culturally very vibrant there. So I wanted to write a book that was kind of gathering together all of this sort of the past and the present and the future of the region. But I was writing it in quite an academic sense. And then the full-scale invasion happened in 2022. And I really felt that writing in kind of a detached academic way was really inappropriate in a way, because the people and the places that I was writing about were, at the very time of my writing, being destroyed by bombs, and the people were being displaced, and they were sheltering in basements and writing to me and sending messages. And I just couldn't write in that sort of detached academic voice that you normally have to put on when you're writing an academic book. And so I decided to write this book, which is a much more personal one, and I put myself in it. And that's quite unusual for the kind of writing that I do. It's much more common for anthropologists, but for cultural historians, you don't normally put yourself in the story. But for this book, I wanted to put myself in the story and to kind of tell the history that I'd been trying to tell in an academic sense through conversations with people, and to also bring to life these places that I'd visited before 2022, which were, as I say, very enchanting in this kind of way in which they had this complex history and this sort of vibrant cultural life, and try and sort of paint a portrait of these places that were, at the time I was writing about them, being destroyed.
Yeah, and there's a lot. There's so much in the book that talks about the much greater diversity of the Donbass than many people would expect. And I know there's a line in the book where you talk about how a lot of international audiences who maybe only see Eastern Ukraine through the prism of current events and through the news, who sort of see it and use this phrase as industrial transition, depletion, and war, and those are the things that people immediately see. But you write about these much more diverse identities that, of course, people have, communities have, and so on. I wonder if you could perhaps give us a bit of a flavour of that much richer environmental, historical, social landscape, and the kinds of things that you've talked about in the book.
Yeah, of course. Well, the thing about this region known as Donbass, and that's not a kind of neutral term. Lots of people don't like that term because it highlights the sort of, it's a geological term in the first sense. It means Donetsk coal basin, Donbass. But some people reject it because it's some Ukrainians reject it because they feel that it reduces the region to just its history of mineral extraction, and doesn't kind of represent this sort of the multitudes that exist there. And also the term Donbass was very heavily stigmatized in Soviet propaganda, and then after 2014 also was associated with this sort of pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, hateful propaganda that was emanating from the occupied territories. So lots of people kind of have an issue with that term, but also people do still continue to use that term as to refer to their home. So when I gave a book talk the other week, we began it by asking people how they feel about this term Donbass, and one person put up their hand and said, "That's my home. That's where I come from. It's got a very sort of intimate, sort of emotional feeling for me." So Donbass is this term that contains the multitudes, in a sense, this sort of toxic, difficult history of extraction and Soviet fetishization, but also this lived experience of life in the proximity of industry, but also all of the cultural multitudes that exist alongside that. But that's to say that, yeah, what I wanted to mention, when I was on one of my expeditions in the region, and I traveled quite a lot with a local historian and cave explorer called Mikhailo Kulishov. And Mikhailo, he was from Horlivka originally, which is in the Donetsk region and had been occupied since 2014. And he'd been displaced to Bakhmut, which, as we know, has also now been destroyed, and he's been displaced for a second time. But when I visited him in Bakhmut, he had this ecotourism firm, and he was trying to develop the ecotourism of the Donbass region. And he did excursions taking people to sort of these geological sites and these places where you can see the salt marshes, and you have marsh samphire, that sea asparagus that we have in Sainsbury's in the supermarket now, that's growing in like huge fields on these salt marshes in all these different colors. And we went to a nature reserve, which was called Chalk Flora, which has these chalk deposits in the ground, and then you have all of this special flora and fauna growing on top of the chalk. And it's stunningly beautiful. The flora and fauna, I hadn't seen anything like that before. It was this very particular kind of natural landscape that occurs in this very mineral-rich environment. And I remember him asking me, after we'd done these excursions around these places and seen all of these sort of geological wonders and these industrial sites, he asked me, what do foreigners think of when they hear the word Donbass? And of course, like at the time, the answer was war and heavy industry. because that's really all the media shows, because that's what the news is about right now. And since 2022, I think probably that image of Donbass has really crystallized as this sort of almost a landscape of post-life, where you just have this destruction, infrastructural destruction and displacement and emptying out of places. And so it's really sort of difficult to excavate this kind of beauty and the cultural riches and the historical kind of depth of the place now, because all that's being shown is this destruction and this devastation. But one of the places I think that was really sort of vibrant and striking for me was Mariupol, which I visited in November 2021. So just a couple of months before this brutal siege that devastated the city, and killed tens of thousands of people and displaced even more. And I met there a really remarkable person who I met lots of really remarkable people there. It was a really interesting place. Mariupol had two really enormous steelworks in it. So before, in the 19th century, I learned that Ebbw Vale in South Wales had one of the biggest steelworks in Europe at the time. And Mariupol had two steelworks of the size of the one that was in Ebbw Vale. And so it was really dominated by these enormous monster factories that you could see from a lot of spots in the city. And as soon as you got off the train there, you smelt the coking ovens. It hit you in the face immediately, and you could feel the kind of pollution from the factories, which would sweep down over the city in these big clouds of heavy smog. But also the city was really well known in 2021 as being one of the most vibrant, dynamic activist hubs in the East. And so I went there with the intention to kind of seek out some of these activists who were doing work there. And I met with a person who I think maybe some of your listeners know about, Sashko Procha from the Free Filmers Collective. And I think you wanted me maybe to read his note, because in the book, it was very important for me in the book to represent people's voices directly. So I invited quite a few people from Eastern Ukraine to write short texts, or to contribute short texts that I could intersperse with my own writing, so that my voice and their voices kind of intermingled. And Sashko, who's a filmmaker and an activist, and now a remarkable humanitarian worker, he wrote one, well, he contributed one of these texts. And so I wanted to read it to you, so you get a sense of his Mariupol and how different it maybe is from the way in which Mariupol has been represented in the media. So I'll just read it for you. My family moved to Mariupol in 1992 when I was 15 years old. But before that, we used to come here on our summer holidays from the 1980s onwards. For me, the city will always be associated with food. Everything in Mariupol was of such good quality. A special kind of dumplings, lemon cake, buckets of apricots. Mariupol's shops were always well stocked in comparison to other cities. I could stand in all of the most interesting queues, and with my eyes closed, distinguish a Rusanivska sausage from an Ostankinska one. I also remember the bookshop Azovstalets, where growing up I bought all of my favorite books, mostly about geography and biology. And for the record, I never once saw a single book there about the Azovstal factory or the metallurgy industry. One of my favorite walks in Mariupol, and a personal one for me, is along the Pishanka beach. This is the place I would always walk with people and thoughts that were most important to me. I've already charged this place with such magnetic energy, or rather romanticized it, that I'll probably return to it even after I die. 30-meter high sandstone cliffs and the most beautiful bee-eater birds in the air, labyrinths of boathouses, people hiding from the busy central beaches. This is my Mariupol Mediterranean, a tremendously important landscape that brings the city close to the lyrical prose of César Pavese. Another walk that I'll never forget is along the highway from the left bank, where I lived in the city centre. This road skirts the edge of the factory for about 5 kilometers, following the monolithically grey factory wall. I've walked down this highway dozens of times, traveled along it by trams thousands of times, and driven down it by marshrutka taxi hundreds of thousands of times. And this wall is a powerful metaphor for my relationship with the city. I used to think that painting it could be like the fall of the Berlin Wall for Mariupol. Later, an artist from Mariupol explained to me that since the Azovstal wall could and should always remain grey, since then it's functioned like a kind of industrial meditation for me, a nothing that is nothing.
Thank you for reading that out. And I think those passages that are written by voices of people who live there and that you talk to are very affecting actually when you read the book. One of the other things that's very striking about the book I found reading it is that you mostly write in the present tense, and you're reading your descriptions, your accounts of for example, visiting that ecotourism company that you referred to in Bakhmut, and you're reading that as if that's what's happening now, and then you get to the end of the chapter, and of course then you're jolted back to, well, actually, this isn't what's in Bakhmut anymore. This is what's happened since, and it's a very striking way of writing. How did you feel about that? About writing in that way? How was that?
Yeah, it was actually you've put your finger on something really particular about the writing process there. And we also had endless conversations with the editor about how to make these tense systems work together. But for me, it felt, because I'd only really just returned from the place, it felt so I don't know, just violent to kind of to only write about it in the past tense, like it was totally gone. And it was very sort of emotional to be writing about these experiences, sort of meeting people and visiting places so soon after returning from them, and knowing that they no longer existed in the same way as I was writing about them. So writing in the present tense was really almost like this sort of meditation, an act of trying to re-inhabit that experience of being back there. And also I felt that it was the most effective way to bring it alive for people. And that was really one of my intentions with the book. I wanted to kind of try and paint a portrait of these places so that people understood that they were something else other than just the pictures of destruction that they were seeing on their TV. I think after I wrote the book, I gave it to lots of friends to read, and one of my friends said that it felt like it was a kind of archival enterprise or an archival project, that I tried to archive something. And I hadn't thought about it in like that in when I was writing it, but now I think about it as perhaps part of this much kind of broader sort of wave of archival projects that happened after the full-scale invasion and the destruction of all of the cities in the east, as well as in other parts of Ukraine. A lot of artists who I know then embarked on these sorts of documentary initiatives, including Sashko Project, who he and his team from the Free Filmers did this wonderful, beautiful project called the Mariupol Memory Park, which is a kind of archival project which has a lot of different multimedia texts and images, film, audio stories in it, all kind of documenting different aspects of life in the city before the full-scale invasion. And there are other projects like that which have tried to capture something of the essence of the life that was erased by Russia's invasion, because the war didn't just erase these infrastructures and architecture and lives, it also erased this cultural reality that had been really present there. And I think a lot of the artists and the cultural activists who were involved in that world were really keen not to allow it to disappear completely from kind of historical knowledge and cultural knowledge, and so have embarked on these very almost like encyclopedically, in some cases, documentary projects where they've tried to capture some of what was going on before 2022. And I think my book is sort of trying to do something similar, although I didn't really sort of fully sort of understand it as that at the time. And I think maybe the present tense is something about that. It's trying to capture something that in the past crystallize it almost, as an emotional reaction to the disappearance of that thing.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe there's an opportunity to read another passage from the book at this point, which I think perhaps brings some of the emotion of that to life.
Yeah, thanks. So I thought maybe we could read a passage from the chapter that I wrote about Severodonetsk from the experience at the summer school in 2019. So I mentioned Severodonetsk was a chemical making city, and it had this very vibrant community of activists who were doing different kinds of cultural projects in the city. And our summer school was hosted by this community of activists who were all resident in a community center called Shakhmatnaya, which had formerly been a chess club in the Soviet period. Shakhmatnaya means chess. And so they kind of hung out in this old chess club, this former chess club. And one of the things that they liked to do was to go to derelict kind of factory buildings and industrial buildings, and to collect there the sort of historical paraphernalia that had been left behind when these buildings had been abandoned, sometimes Soviet, often Soviet paraphernalia. This stuff that had kind of been abandoned as historical trash because nobody wanted it anymore. And there was this big movement, which was a bit like the urbex movement in the UK, this urban exploration movement where people, like young people, often sort of a subcultural kind of underground type of thing, go to abandoned buildings and explore them and take a lot of photographs. Abandoned buildings are very photogenic, and especially with Instagram, you can make like amazing photographs of them and put them online. And so, but in Eastern Ukraine, there was also the added kind of intrigue of these buildings being part of this kind of heavily stigmatized Soviet heritage, which nevertheless was so formative for creating these monotowns in Eastern Ukraine and creating the communities that emerged around them. So they were an important part of the history of these communities, but a part of that, but a history that was being sort of devalued and kind of marginalized at the time in 2019 when we visited. So it was this ambiguous history that was very intriguing for young people. And so the activists in Severodonetsk would often go to these derelict buildings, collect these objects, and then they were compiling it into what they called an archive of deindustrialization. And that archive they kept in a back room of the community center. And when we had our summer school, we could go and look at all these objects. They collected photo albums and pamphlets, gas masks, clocks, old videotapes, all of this kind of curious historical artifacts, and kind of touching them and looking at them, you could try and make sense of what had happened in this region and what the experience that it had gone through. Anyway, so this excerpt that I wanted to read was about the last night of our summer school, and I'm talking to one of the activists who was very very involved in this community about these abandoned buildings, which in Russian were called Zaboroshki. And so I'll read this to you. On the last day of our visit, we take a trip to another well-loved local Zaboroshka. The building is a so-called long build, one of the many construction projects abandoned in the 2000s due to bankruptcy or corruption, which had once been intended to house an IT hub and training center for students and young specialists from Azot and other industrial plants. Our group has agreed to meet on the roof of the building site to drink beer and take in the sunset. Crossing the building's threshold through a hole cut in the chain-link fence, we follow a makeshift path through the rubble that suggests the frequency of visitors to the site. We climb a set of concrete stairs that has come away from the wall and looks worryingly precarious, passing floors of heavily graffitied rooms that are clearly well-used hangouts of local teenagers. On the roof, the most remarkable view awaits us. Bathed in late evening sunlight, the urban landscape of concrete high-rises ends abruptly, giving way to rolling forested steppe. Here, more than anywhere else in the city, one feels the utopian hubris of Soviet industrial modernity. Severodonetsk, the Soviet city of chemists, feels somehow stranded here, deep in the post-Soviet Ukrainian steppe. That night, as we sip our beers and watch the ebbing sunlight, I ask Sasha what he would like to see done with all the region's many abandoned industrial buildings. Would he prefer them to be reanimated as part of a reindustrialized and economically thriving Donbass, or dismantled and cleared from sight like the former steelworks of South Wales? He tells me that his dream would be for them to be adapted into community centres or art spaces, places where artists and activists like those who gather at Shakhmatnaya could continue to conduct their work. He talks about the derelict Belgian-built caustic soda factory in Lysychansk. Couldn't this become a community hub filled with co-working spaces, plants, and smiling young creatives like those you see in Warsaw or Berlin? But these dreams have no chance of being realized while the war's still raging on just hours down the road. Who in their right mind, he asks, would invest in the region's derelict industrial infrastructure when it might any day be razed to the ground by an off-course Russian missile? Sasha had been more prescient than I'd realized that night. The Belgian-built industrial relics in Lysychansk, which had hosted all-night raves and dynamic activist festivals, attracting audiences from across Ukraine, were destroyed by Russian bombs in 2022. He sent me photos of the handsome red brick buildings in flames from the basement he was sheltering in, followed by images of Lysychansk's half-derelict oil refinery, which burnt for 3 days, turning the sky black with huge plumes of dirty smoke, and the nitric acid plant in neighboring Rubizhnya, which, following hits by Russian bombs, sent mushroom clouds of toxic orange gases into the atmosphere. Severodonetsk was razed to the ground by Russian shelling, which hit the city repeatedly throughout the summer of 2022. The ice palace of sport burnt down following a missile strike, its mosaics horribly charred. The activist community and their preservationist projects were pushed out of the city. Today, under Russian occupation, its history is being twisted in a different direction.
Which, as I say, really brings home that sort of tragic juxtaposition, doesn't it, of you speaking in the present tense, of how things were at the time and then what happened afterwards. Yeah. We found since we started our Ukraine appeal back in 2022, we found that there are a whole range of organisations that maybe were involved in sporting activity, sports clubs, cultural organisations, people who were doing all sorts of things in the community, but perhaps not necessarily in a explicitly welfare sort of area of activity, kind of quite quickly pivoted and then became those organisations that we were supporting to provide emergency aid, provide mental health support, and various other things. And you talk a bit in the book about that as well, I think, don't you? About that kind of way in which people, got on with things and did things across a whole range of fronts.
Yeah, that's right. I think Ukraine's very well known for its remarkable levels of self-organization. And I think people who kind of traveled in Ukraine and worked on Ukraine knew about that before 2022. But then it was brought to the whole world's attention after 2022 when the country just mobilized, and inside and outside of the country, to sort of fundraise for the military, to deliver humanitarian aid, to organize convoys of trucks to get people out of the occupied zone, and to get the kind of medical equipment and supplies that people needed into the territories that were on the front line. And I think, people were really shocked about that. And I remember people asking me, how do they do it? How are they so resilient? And how do they know how to do that? And I think, having spent quite a lot of time in Eastern Ukraine between 2019 and 2021, you could see that self-organization was really a part of everyday cultural life there. And Daria Tymbaluk and I actually kind of did a bit of ethnographic research with artists and cultural activist groups there to kind of talk to people about how they understood the work that they were doing. And we picked up on this one phrase that people used, делать нечего in Russian, робите ничего in Ukrainian, which has this double meaning of there's nothing to do, and also there's nothing else for it. And we kind of, in an article that we wrote together, we developed this idea that because there's nothing to do, because the infrastructure was kind of not particularly strong, the cultural infrastructure and the welfare infrastructure, partly because of the neoliberalization of the Ukrainian state since the end of socialism, but also which meant that the state sort of withdrew and offloaded a lot of its traditional responsibilities onto citizens and volunteers and NGOs and other kinds of civic organizations. Because that infrastructure, that state infrastructure wasn't present, a lot of it kind of encouraged this attitude, oh, there's nothing else for it, we better do it for ourselves because the state's not going to do it. And you could see that certainly after 2014, when Russia began its military operation in eastern Ukraine, the most kind of dynamic, effective, and engaged community organizations were often self-organized, like the Free Filmers organization, and then would kind of fundraise and support their activities in various different ways, looking for the kinds of funds that fit with their politics and fit with how they understood their work, and the partnerships that they wanted to form to support the work that they were doing. But yeah, so there was a really sort of kind of remarkably complex social texture in Ukraine even before 2022, with a lot of kind of entrepreneurial spirit, I would say, which you can still see very much today. I've got PhD students in the University of St Andrews, and they're all incredibly self-organized and run kind of artist residencies in Kharkiv and kind of set up fundraising initiatives and do pop-up exhibitions, which have sort of the role of kind of creating sort of more public understanding or visibility around certain topics. And it's really quite remarkable the level of get up and go that young people from Ukraine have. But I think this is part of the culture of self-organization that was already present, as I say, in the sort of first decades after socialism because of the neoliberalization of the state, about which other anthropologists such as Emily Channell Justice have written a lot. But since 2014 and Maidan, and then the full-scale, the Russian occupation of parts of the Donbass region, this kind of feeling of existential necessity, I think, really accelerated that kind of self-organization, because a lot of people, particularly in these frontline regions, felt the real need to do something in order to resist this sort of toxic Russian world propaganda that was emanating from the occupied territories, and to organize and create social spaces where you could articulate a different kind of Ukrainian identity and help to resist this very powerful cultural force that was coming from the direction of Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, and on your just going back to what you were saying just now about the kind of ability to pivot, the ability to organize, the ability, the ability to get on with stuff. You talk a bit in the book about international aid as well, and of course that comes with some things that run counter to that in terms of conditionality and regulations and all of the rest of it. But you talk a bit about the sort of strategies and approaches that groups on the ground have had in working with that, making it work, getting around it, and so on. I wonder if you might say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying, I quite often get asked when I give talks about, well, where did the money come from for this kind of activity? And it's sometimes asked, I think, just out of sort of, genuine interest. And it's sometimes asked because people believe that there was this flow of capital from the US in particular that then kind of underpinned this cultural turn in Ukraine in their thinking away from sort of pro-Russianness and towards sort of pro-Western culture. But I think, having spent quite a lot of time in eastern Ukraine before the full-scale invasion in that 2019 to 2021 period, when there was a lot of kind of foreign capital circulating in the region, and you could see a lot of US aid sort of signs up on various kinds of cultural buildings and buildings that had been renovated, as well as EU plaques and that sort of thing. The thing that I took away was that there was this foreign aid, but also there was real agency in among the local actors to kind of handle this complex funding landscape and to use the aid to do projects that that were wanted by the communities on the ground. So it wasn't that they were kind of like sort of mindlessly sort of reproducing the political values that were attached to the aid that came to the region. It was that there was this very kind of savvy awareness of how to kind of direct that stream of funding in order to do the projects that were most meaningful for local communities. And I found that really impressive, that, you know, there was a kind of healthy degree of detachment from some of the expectations of that aid, you know, and that also an ability to kind of perform for the funders, the kinds of discourses that were required, while also doing work that was really meaningful and impactful on the ground. And I don't mean to suggest, you know, that the people doing projects were very cynical. I think, you know, they really appreciated the money that was made available. But I think it's good that there wasn't just this very hierarchical sort of imposition of values that came with the aid that, you know, sort of very politicized funders like USAID and even sort of the EU with its various kinds of expectations delivered. That I mean, just yeah, perhaps I'll just leave it there. But yeah, I think it's important to understand that local communities have always had agency and have been able to navigate that landscape very successfully and effectively and deliver projects in the ways that they've wanted to deliver them, not in the ways that they've been told to deliver them.
Mm. And I think that's a really important message, and so, you know, something that we're very much trying. That's very much part of the ethos of the funds that we've been running as well. So towards the end of the book, you catch up in Lviv, so the other side of Ukraine, with some of your colleagues, some of your friends from Donbass that have been displaced. I wonder if you might want to say something about what your perception is of the way in which Donbass is seen in Western and Central Ukraine, and whether that perception has changed as a consequence of population movement and as a consequence of war.
Yeah, so Donbass was a region that was stigmatized inside Ukraine as well as outside of Ukraine. And I think, you know, my Ukrainian PhD students would like, you know, talk about this, and I'm sure Ukrainians know what I'm talking about. I think I remember seeing a talk in at the Harvard University Research Institute, where they showed the statistics of the number of Ukrainians who'd actually visited Eastern Ukraine before 2014. And it was a really small number of people who didn't come from that region had ever gone there. And, you know, that's not unusual if you think of kind of industrialized regions of the UK, like Middlesbrough or something. You know, I didn't go to Middlesbrough as a kid on my holidays with my family. And Teesside too, you know, I don't think I've ever been there, although I would actually genuinely be really interested in going there now. But these industrialized places, sometimes they're just, we know about them, but we never go there because people feel like there's no reason to go there. But actually, I've heard, and I will go to Middlesbrough, that there's an amazing kind of art scene in Middlesbrough, and they run these incredible art residencies, a little bit similarly to Eastern Ukraine. Or maybe a better example, one that I didn't know, no, Middlesbrough and Teesside are really good examples, I think. But Glasgow, for example, Glasgow is quite stigmatized in the UK. And I'd never been to Glasgow before I moved to Scotland. And then I moved to Glasgow and lived there and realized it's one of the best cities in the UK and just like an incredible cultural scene. But because of, I think, the association with industry and then some of the kind of socioeconomic characteristics that come along with post-industry, Glasgow has been stigmatized, and it's been stigmatized on our TVs and represented in a certain way. Um, and so I think, Eastern Ukraine was a bit like that. People thought about it. They hadn't been there, but they had ideas about it. And so there was this stigma associated with it. And then after 2014, when you had this first wave of displacement from the region, people then encountered people from Eastern Ukraine in different parts of the country. And I think at that time, the perception started to shift, although there was still kind of a lot of prejudices. Um, but since 2022, I think, with that really large scale displacement of people from the region to all parts of Ukraine, I think then you have really seen a sort of fundamental shift where it's almost doesn't make sense to talk about this kind of distinction like between East and West, North and South anymore, because the East is in the West and the West is in the um, the East is in the West and the North is in the South, and all of these regions are kind of transforming demographically, and that is leading to a much more sort of diverse demographic um, environment in cities. And so there are a lot of kind of people from Eastern Ukraine who are in Western Lviv now, and that culture, which was quite specific to Eastern Ukraine, of this kind of subcultural sort of almost like some kind of genre of hipster-esque like kind of exploration of ruined buildings and this historical trash is being brought into this other part of the country. When I was in Lviv, actually, we went to a bar with some friends from Eastern Ukraine, and they were talking about how this bar had to have been created by somebody from Luhansk or from Kharkiv because it was too cool to be somebody from Lviv who'd made this bar. So you could definitely see these different kinds of aesthetics and kind of cultural tendencies kind of moving to different parts of the country and mixing up the cultural life and the cultural landscapes there. So definitely, I think, perceptions are changing because the visibility of the communities and the cultures is becoming greater in different parts of the country.
Yeah, and so I suppose we're just about to launch, or we are launching today, our Ukraine Resilience Fund. And I noticed in the book that you've got some comments on the term resilience. I think we'd already decided on the term Ukraine Resilience Fund before we'd read your book. But it'd be interesting just to get your take on that, because you do talk about that term. You've got like a bit of a chapter about that.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, so I do have a critical take on this idea of resilience, but it's not intended to be pointed in the direction of like funds like yours, which I think are really remarkable. It's more, I think, about the kind of uncritical use of that term in the media, and the way it sometimes gets used to kind of suggest a sort of superhuman quality of survival against all odds, that is in itself kind of otherizing, to without getting too academic about it. There's a beautiful article that was written by the Palestinian scholar Malika Shwaich about resilience, and the way it gets used to talk about communities in Palestine. And that was published in the London Review of Books. And I'd recommend maybe having a look at that because she really develops that whole criticism of resilience as a discourse of kind of detached, looking from a distance of privilege at a community that is experiencing suffering, and the way in which that resilience discourse can also be problematic in its own right, as suggesting the kind of the uniqueness or particularity of that community to withstand that difficulty, and the suggestion that, well, we'd never be able to do that. And yeah, I think just with that term resilience, you have to think about sort of what you're kind of intending by it. And surely, there is enormous resilience in Ukraine, and you can see it. But I think we have to just be aware that it's the normalization of something that should never have to be normalized. It's not the superhuman capacity of Ukrainians to suffer endless kinds of violence that makes them resilient. It's kind of just the normalization of something that is outrageous and should never be normalized. So we just have to, I think, be wary of that term resilience becoming a way to normalize this situation. But yeah, read Malika Shwaikh's article on it because she explains it much better than I do. But I do I don't have a problem with it in the name of your fund, so I think you should keep it named as it is.
Thank you. That's good to hear. But equally important to hear your point about not using words to normalize situations. And I guess in the general media broadly, it becomes very easy for something that is horrendous to become normalized, because at the moment that it's not on page one anymore, it's on some, page 3 or 4 or something, and it becomes something that people regard as normal. I guess just finally, and then we'll open it up to some questions. One of the things that, or I suppose the key thing that comes out throughout the book, is the sort of ingenuity, the innovation, the commitment, that the depth of multiple complicated community identities and the whole complexity of the region. If we were putting that into what can we do now for those of us that have got either funds to give, and we're quite a small funder in the scheme of things, but obviously there are others, but for those of us with funds to give, or for those with other ways in which they can offer support, what should we be doing, and what should others like us be doing?
Yeah, well, you're doing all the right things, I think. And anybody who can donate to an organization like yours, your funds are going in exactly the right direction. So I saw on Instagram actually a post by the Free Filmers Collective recently about some of the work that they'd been doing with the funds that you'd sent. And it was really heartwarming and inspiring and remarkable. And they were talking about how they were buying equipment for grassroots workshops and that sort of develop military aid, but also deliver medical equipment and first aid for military doctors, that build medical equipment for deoccupied villages and look after refugee and Roma families in Zaporizhia. And that's the kind of work, I think. We talked already about this incredible level of self-organization that exists in Ukraine, and how many kind of arts organizations and activist organizations have pivoted to do this really necessary humanitarian work right now. That work is done with an enormous amount of energy and passion, but I really feel it's important to underline how depleting it is as well, because it's all done voluntarily, and people just don't stop. And I see my friends in Ukraine working tirelessly, never taking breaks from the humanitarian work that they're doing, and in these really most extreme of conditions, doing this most necessary work with the most vulnerable people. And I'm truly inspired by it, but I know the toll that it takes as well. And it's very hard on mental health and physical health. People are really tired after all of these years of doing this work. And so I think that the funding that we can donate via organizations like yours gives the opportunity to employ more people, to take a little bit of that pressure off these individuals who are really sinking all of their energies into this work, and to make that work a little bit more sustainable, and to allow the people who do it to take a weekend off, or to be able to not have to do this kind of day and night, because it is such important work, and it's done with such grace and an incredible sort of values and ethics. But yeah, I just I worry for my activist friends how much they give to this, and I think any funds that we can part with to make that work a little bit easier and more bearable, to make it better resourced and to allow it to be more sustainable, then we absolutely have to do that. That's the least we can do sitting in our privileged context in Western Europe. And yeah, thank you to BEARR, because your organization is getting funds to the community groups that need it most, who are doing the most remarkable kinds of work on the ground on these in frontline territories with the most vulnerable groups. So I really admire what you're doing. And yeah, I urge everybody in the audience today to donate if they can.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that endorsement. And before I forget, because I just noticed that Anna Bowles, who is in the audience, has just put a link to something about Free Filmers and some of the other organisations that she's in contact with in Ukraine. I was going to give a shout out anyway, but I'll do it now because it's sort of current, because you've seen the link. But many of you probably subscribe to Anna's Substack. If you don't, you kind of should, really, because it's excellent and it's a real insight into what's happening on the ground with very much the sorts of organisations that we're interested in supporting as well. So it's Anna Talks Ukraine, if you want to look that up on Substack, and I'd very much encourage you to subscribe to that and donate to Anna for that as well. Thank you very much, Victoria. We could probably go on with lots more questions for several more hours, but thank you very much. That's absolutely fantastic, and we really appreciated you being here and taking the time this evening. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I've got a couple that have already been highlighted in the chat. If you've got another question that you want to ask, because I can't see everybody that's on the screen, the easiest way of doing it is if you just put it in the chat and then it'll pop up. What I think would be quite good, just so that it's good to get a few more voices, isn't it, really? So we've got a couple of questions from Janet Gunn. We've got a question from Arma Wason, and then a question from Anna Beria. Shall we start with Janet? And I wonder, Janet, if you could unmute yourself, and I think you had two questions, and maybe if you could put those first, and then Victoria can answer those first.
Hello, Victoria. I thought your talk was fantastic. That's really interesting. I have been to Donetsk, and I actually observed the presidential elections for the OSCE in Mariupol in 2019. So I've been to both those places that you've mentioned. I just wondered, I think the first of my questions is more relevant to what you've been talking about than the second, which is about the Greek community. Probably like many British post-industrial and industrial areas, a football team is a really important part of sort of social cohesion. Personally, I know very little about football, but I know that Shakhtar Donetsk was an incredibly important and element in the city's life, and people were incredibly proud of it. As far as I know, it went off to Lviv and is functioning from there now. I mean, have you had any contact with them at all, or are they still doing anything to support their region? Well, I don't suppose they can, because not much of it is not occupied now.
Thanks, Janet. I don't know too much about the football team. I know more about the Mariupol Greeks, but it is the thing that people often mention in connection with Donetsk, because lots of people have heard Shakhtar Donetsk, which is Shakhtar means miner. So it's interesting that the football team is actually sort of named after the profession of miners, and so many other toponyms in that region are named after things to do with mining and coal. So you can really see in that kind of the way in which, in the same way as the word Donbass that I talked about is a shortening of Donetsk coal base, and this toponymy of industry is everywhere, sort of suggesting how much it's embedded in kind of cultural history and identity. But yeah, no, sadly, I know very little about the football team and how they've been they've been involved. But maybe you can ask your second question, because I do know something about the Mariupol Greeks.
Well, go ahead then. I know that it was very distinctive that the area still had a Greek community, and I just wondered if they'd all gone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really an interesting story about the Mariupol Greeks, who were an ethnic minority in Mariupol and in other parts of this region called Priazovia, sometimes referred to as Priazovia, the region, the kind of the coastline on the Azov Sea in the south of Ukraine. There's a really great article actually that was also published on the Mariupol Memory Park site by Alexander Rybalko, who researched the Mariupol Greeks, and I would recommend that to start off with. And a lot of what I'll say is kind of drawing on that article. So I would read that article, because it also has some lovely, beautiful photographs of the Mariupol Greek communities, and their kind of literature and the dictionaries between Ukrainian and the Greek dialects. But so the interesting history about how they ended up there is also a colonial history. So this southeastern part of Ukraine was first colonized by the Russian Empire in the mid-1700s, when Catherine II, sometimes referred to as Catherine the Great, was in power. And she sort of occupied this part of today's Ukraine, and she called it Novorossiya, New Russia. That's also that was nothing unusual at the time. Empires would often name their newly colonized lands after themselves. Think of New England, New York. So this New Russia for Catherine the Great was her newly colonized territory, which she wanted to populate with settler colonists. And she encouraged people from other parts of the empire to move there by creating all sorts of incentives. Like if you moved to this part, then you could have a larger piece of land, you could get sort of more farm animals, you would get exemption from military service. And if you think about what Putin is doing now in this territory, which is occupied again, reoccupied after 2022, it's doing the exact same thing, making kind of real estate kind of incentives for Russians from Russia to move to Mariupol and to kind of buy up property there that used to be inhabited by Ukrainians. Anyway, I digress. So the Greeks were forcibly relocated to Mariupol and to other parts of the Azov Sea coast during this first stage of colonization by Catherine II. They were, before that, they lived in Crimea, and had for several hundreds, if not thousands of years, because Crimea was a Greek colony back in the times of ancient Greece. So the Greek community in Crimea was forcibly relocated in the mid-1700s to this Azov Sea region, and they recreated some of their cities there that they had been moved away from in Crimea. So there's a Yalta on this coast, and there's a Yalta in Crimea as well, and some other cities with similar names. And Mariupol, that ending, the Upol, which sounds a bit like Constantinople, that was a Greek name for the city. So the Azov Greeks actually sort of founded Mariupol, or sort of they're the mythologized founders of the city, and the name of the city references this history of the Greeks who were moved there by Catherine II. So it's interesting and heartbreaking that the presence of that Greek community in the city is bookended by these two colonial violences, the violence of Catherine II, who forcibly relocated them, and now Putin's recolonial violence, which has forcibly displaced them, and in some cases, many of them died as well. So again, like sort of erasing a community as a consequence of this sort of colonial politics.
Thank you, and thanks, Janet, for the question. Can we go to Amra Wason now? Amra, I don't know if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think you unmuted yourself. Yeah.
now I'm muted. Hello. It's fascinating listening to you, Victoria. I really enjoyed what you've had to say, and it all rings very true with my experience. And it's also very hopeful just to remember how much agency there is in sort of grassroots work in Donbass. And though I haven't spent time there before the full-scale invasion, I was working with activists who were running work for parent disability activists, basically trying to set up services to prevent babies being placed in institutions, which is the whole sort of Soviet way of dealing with disability. And the two particular leaders, one in Severodonetsk and one in Mariupol, were just extraordinary. I mean, they were indefatigable and very hopeful, and they brought together the Hromada officials and the medical people, the doctors, and they managed to set up services for families at the point at which a very small baby might appear to have problems. So it was just magnificent to watch both of these activists, really. And they've both, of course, now outside Ukraine, and, it's all, their services don't exist anymore. So, but I'm really interested in whether you came across, I mean, when you talk about activists, where you came across activists working for that kind of grassroots social change, perhaps working with, I mean, Severodonetsk, the authorities were actually very corrupt, and it took 3 years for them to set up this service, but then it was a flagship service and really impressive. And I just wonder if I never spent time talking to them about what else was happening in those cities. And I wonder if their work was sort of unique, or whether there were other people who were, campaigning and bringing people together for those sorts of issues.
Oh yeah, thanks for that question, and really interesting to hear about your work. Yeah. So one thing that came to mind when you were talking was another group in Mariupol who I was able to visit, called Platforma Chu, and they were an organization that was working in particular with teenagers, but specifically with not only but had a focus on queer teenagers as well, which was I think it was a very important thing to do in a city like Mariupol, which was sort of because of the presence of industry and sort of working class culture, was like a very patriarchal city, where it was difficult to be a queer teenager. So this organization was trying to create a space where, an accepting space for kind of teenagers who felt that they didn't belong in this quite sort of masculinist, patriarchal kind of culture. And I visited them on that same visit when I met Sashko and in Mariupol, and had a tour of their premises. They had this building that they'd kind of managed to take over, and they were using it for various kinds of workshops with young people, kind of teaching young people how to creative skills, how to do sort of photography and create artwork, and to do curation, and teaching them to be cultural managers, but also trying to sort of help them to develop their kind of their voices as political subjects. So the person who was showing me around, who was another really remarkable person called Masha Pronina, she told me about how they were trying to teach young people how to write letters of petition to politicians, that they would have to kind of listen to and not ignore, that they were teaching them how to make posters that could go viral on social media, all of these skills that you need in order to pressure people in power to make changes and to actually do things, rather than just sort of blah blah talking about making changes and never making changes. So I felt that was a really interesting organization. I'd already heard quite a lot about it from other people in Ukraine. It was well known that this kind of group of feminists and queer activists were present in Mariupol and doing this work there. And I don't think it was easy work to do in the context. So it was really interesting to see what they were actually up to there. And when I visited, they had a couple of exhibitions up at a mezzanine floor that they used as a gallery, and they had a couple of exhibitions of work by the young artists who they'd been working with, and the works were really powerful and beautiful on themes like, you know, loneliness and social alienation and imagining an alternative future to working in the factory. And they were working with all of these difficult themes and kind of developing this new generation of Ukrainians who was sort of thinking in a different direction to perhaps previous generations. And again, like you know, like we were talking about in Severodonetsk, that work was displaced, but still remains. It's still happening in different sort of places. So now they're touring. They've made a film about their work in Mariupol, and they're kind of touring that at the moment. So that work still goes on, but not there anymore, sadly.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Thanks very much. I think we've got time for one more question. And can I go to Anna Beria now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Great. Yes, I had the opportunity to visit Ukraine. I was there still a week ago for 2 weeks with a group of just people, mostly Swedes, organized by an elderly couple who used to be travel agents. And the purpose of going was to show solidarity, friendship, support, and also bring as much money as we could, just cash, and give it to the organizations that we were set up to meet. And we met a good number of them, about 10 in just 10 days in 4 different cities. It was an absolute eye-opener, and I was bowled over by the initiatives, by the resilience of the people we met, and the young people committed to doing what they could to support their country and the rest of the people. My question is, I still managed to come across, we were traveling by train, by night train, and there were Russian speakers, and I can speak Russian, so I was talking to them. We came across people who seemed to really support the invasion. And I wonder whether there was a sense that perhaps in the regions that have been invaded, there was some kind of widespread resentment for being at the margin of Ukrainian society. What justifies this feeling? Why is not everybody on board with trying to oppose the invasion?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So that wasn't my experience when I was traveling in Eastern Ukraine at all, actually. It was quite the opposite. I think partly because the beginning of the war in 2014 had done such a lot of damage to the economy and to the prospects for kind of future kind of development of cultural life and social life. There was this sort of radicalization in that part of Ukraine against Russia, particularly among kind of younger generations of people. I think, you know, there was a real feeling of resentment against Russia. Obviously, that region of Ukraine had always had a lot of links kind of with people crossing the border to Russia to work, particularly after the closure of a lot of the factories and mines in Donbass in the 1990s and 2000s. Lots of people traveled for work. There were kind of family ties across borders. So there were certainly these kind of strong connections across the border. But after Russia invaded in 2014, and, you know, everybody who I spoke to understood that as a Russian invasion when I was visiting between 2019 and 2021. There was no ambiguity about that. There was a real radicalization of resentment and anger against Russia for all of the damage that it caused and the way in which it had basically compromised the future of the younger generation. So my experience was very different. I can't say I encountered anybody who supported Russia and the war when I was traveling in eastern Ukraine. Quite the opposite. It was one of the sort of most radicalized regions against the war and the terrible socioeconomic consequences it was having for the country.
Thank you. That's reassuring. I wasn't traveling in eastern Ukraine. We were kept well away from the occupied territories, of course. No, the nearest we got was Mykolaiv. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody. I'm just wondering, is that a final question that's just appeared in the chat? I'm just looking because we do have a couple of minutes. No, don't think so. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you for giving us your time and your insights. And I think, you know, one of the things that we can take away from this is firstly the complexity of the Donbass, and all of those different levels of identity that you talk about, and then perhaps, I mean, Arma in some ways made that key point in her question about recognizing the agency of those community organizations and those people that are working on the ground, and making sure that in everything we do we're reinforcing that and making sure that we respond to that. But thank you very much for giving us your time this evening, and thanks to everybody else for coming and joining us tonight. You'll all want to buy the book now, obviously, and it looks like that if you haven't seen it. So watch out for that in the bookshop. If you want to order it online, it's available from Daunt Books, so you can get it direct from the publisher. But there are lots of other places you can get it as well, of course. So watch out for it, and please do buy it and read it. If you'd like to donate to BEARR's Ukraine Community Resilience Fund, the easiest way that you can do that is just to go onto the BEARR website at bearr.org, and you can donate via our CAF Donate page. And you can either make a one-off donation, or if you want to make a regular donation, we'd be very grateful for that as well, of course. Every donation that you do give will help community-based organisations offering very practical support to communities on the ground in Ukraine. So your money will be used and will go directly to those communities. And whether you donate or not, we'll keep you up to date on our website and in our newsletter with everything that we're doing. So thank you very much for all your support in whichever way you give it. Have a very good evening, and I'm sure we'll probably see some of you at future BEARR events later in the year. Thank you very much.